Welcome to the Ceremon Valley Democratic Club. Tonight we have a great speaker from UC Berkeley's Department of Political Science, Professor Susan D. Hyde. She will speak on democracy. And you know, on January 6th, we almost lost our democracy. In fact, our democracy has been threatened for 4 years. The title of Professor Hyde's talk is "Did Democracy in the US Bend or Break? Democratic Institutions in Global Context." We're glad you're here tonight. My name is Brody Hilp. I'm the president of the Ceremon Valley Democratic Club. And you know, we're all more calm now because we have someone who has honor and dignity and respect and compassion in the White House. And I think on the first day, President Biden signed 17 executive orders, and he signed a whole lot, many more, maybe about 60 now. But that's just a start. We as Democrats we still have a lot of work to do. We have to advocate for our progressive values, for our progressive policies. So consider getting plugged into a Democratic club to do that. Consider joining the Ceremon Valley Democratic Club. We're on Zoom and I see people in the waiting room. So as I let them in, I'm going to turn the meeting over to our Vice President, Richard Adler, to tell us about the club. Thank you, Richard.
And I'm the only Richard Adler here that can talk, not the other three. Thank you for joining us tonight. At our club, the San Ramon Valley Democratic Club, we strive to do, well, 4 basic things. 1, educate ourselves and our community with expert speakers. We try to inspire political engagement and dialogue. We lobby our legislators for progressive values. We work alongside our elected officials to advance local, state, and federal democratic principles. And you know, it's a great thing to stay engaged as we are doing right now during COVID.
Oh, that's not good. We like that.
So I invite you to all the other people to become actual members. We try to be accessible with low membership fees. The dues are $25 for individuals and $45 per family. And you can visit our website at SRVDEMS.org. That is SRV, San Ramon Valley, and then DEMS, DEMS.org, and then click on the tab to become a member. And just before we get back to Brody, I want to remind you that if you're just joining us, please mute yourself and stay muted throughout the meeting. And if you have any questions for the speaker, please type that in chat. Chat is located at the bottom of your screen. And if you are on a tablet, go to the upper right-hand corner and click on the dots. Then from the drop-down box, you will find chat. And back to you, Brody.
Thank you, Richard. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Professor Susan Hyde. At UC Berkeley, she is a professor of political science. She is also the Avice M. Chair of Public Policy and the co-director of the Institute of International Studies. She received her BA in 2000 from Linfield University in Oregon. And she earned her PhD from the University of California, San Diego in 2006. She then went on to teach at Yale University for about 10 years. She also held a residential fellowship at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Her field of study includes international relations, elections, election manipulation, comparison of democracies around the world. In fact, an interesting fact is that she has been an official election observer in Afghanistan, Albania, Indonesia, Liberia, Nicaragua, Pakistan, and Venezuela. Dr. Hyde and her co-author, Elizabeth Saunders, won an Albie Award This is a prestigious award. It's given to the best work in political economy that has made us rethink the world in such a way that we will never be able to unthink the argument. Tonight, Dr. Hyde's talk is Did Democracy in the US Bend or Break? Democratic Institutions in Global Context. Dr. Hyde, thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you very much. I just need a moment to get my screen share working and then I'll get started. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak with you all. Brody, would you mind just confirming that what I'm sharing with you is just...
Yes, we see it.
Okay, just making sure that you could all see it. At this point, I won't be able to see you because I'm going to make it so that I can just focus on my notes and try not to get too distracted here. The thing that I wanted to talk to you today about is this topic of US democracy bending or breaking. It's something that I'm sure has been on many of your minds, and it's something that I think much of the commentary, at least that I've been reading, tends to want to view this issue in very black and white terms. And so I'm going to spend some time talking about this tonight. I will warn you that I did something that I don't normally do. And rather than giving you an academic talk that I have sort of canned and ready to go, I'm instead giving you a talk that I wrote just for you. So for better or worse, that's what I'll be focusing on this evening. I also wanted to share a bit of just very light personal history, which is that my great grandparents lived in California back in the day. They immigrated here via Hawaii, and my great grandmother ran for the California State Assembly I think in 1950. On a platform of migrant workers' rights. So I love that story about her. She did a lot of things, and she was a really active person in the Bay Area on a lot of social justice issues. So it's fun for me to be talking to all of you, given that you're doing similar work in your own lives. So the motivation for the talk that I wanted to give is in many ways an effort to combine some of my recent academic research with some of the more general audience writing that I did in 2020. I'm going to make a few sort of separate points throughout the talk and then try to bring them all together at the end. And I hope that works okay for everyone. This picture that I think you could, for those of you who have a screen, is a political cartoon of a congressional brawl in the US Congress in 1798. And it was somewhat reminiscent of some things that we've been witnessing lately in US politics. The subject that I want to focus on today is motivated a bit by recent events in the US, but I also want to emphasize that political violence, questions about democracy, threats to democracy, and many of the things that we're going to talk about this evening are in many ways timeless topics. Before I get too far, I wanted to emphasize one thing, which is that Brody shared with me some information about some of my colleagues and other political scientists who you've had as speakers in your series previously. And I want to emphasize one difference between me and most of them, at least the ones that I heard about, which is that I am not an Americanist. I come at this from a very different perspective. I'm going to try to emphasize a lot of what I've learned from studying elections around the world, from studying and writing about democratic backsliding, from thinking and writing about election fraud and how to deter it, from thinking and writing about election violence, from my focus on international election monitoring in my research, in which they attempt to try to figure out what the problems are with elections and how they might be remedied such that elections can be good enough for the moment. I just, hang on a second. Brady, I just want to emphasize, you're not looking at my notes, correct? Whoops, you're muted.
No, we can't see your notes.
Okay, sorry, the screen changed a little bit and it made me worry just for a second. So one moment, that would be a bad presentation if I did that. And then there's this other thing that I've been writing and thinking about lately that is the piece with my co-author Elizabeth Saunders that led us to the Albee Award that Brody mentioned, which is thinking about the role that regime type plays in international relations. So thinking about whether a country is a democracy or not, and how that plays into its foreign policy, and also how the regime type of the most powerful states in the international system influences how they interact with other states in the international system. I spent a lot of the fall, because of what I study, because I study election violence and election fraud and also international election monitoring and these efforts to assess what's wrong with democracy in advance of elections, I spent a ton of time this fall talking to journalists, both from the US and from all over the world, about the US elections, which again is weird for me because I don't normally study American politics. The most common question that I got asked is what my worst case scenario was, what I was worried about, and how we should begin to think about these problems and these processes in light of what was going on. As a result, I ended up writing way more opinion pieces and invited pieces like this piece in the Wall Street Journal that they asked me to write about what real election fraud actually looks like, given all of the accusations that were flying around in the US. And in trying to write these pieces, I spent quite a bit of time trying to think about and summarize some of what we know about democracy and democratic backsliding globally in order to paint what I think is probably a more nuanced picture of democratic backsliding, and how what's happening in the US fits in with broader global trends, as well as how so in some ways I'm going to talk about how what's happening in the US is similar to what's happening in other countries. And the other thread that I want to tie into this conversation is how the US's status and experience with democracy is influential to the governance structures of many countries around the world. And this is not just about the US model or any notion that, that the US is trying to promote its own particular version of democracy in other countries. It's more that for a long time, the US has been very prominent in defending individual rights, human rights, has responded to pro-democracy movements in a lot of ways. And so I do want to emphasize that this is something that I think is very universal, is very present right now for Americans, but it's also a very similar debate to a debate and a controversy and a set of concerns that many citizens are experiencing around the world. Okay, so one of the things that I have noticed in recent commentary, especially commentary in the early days after the November 2020 elections in the United States, is that my colleagues, many of my colleagues, including many colleagues who I have enormous amounts of respect for, were really trying to determine whether US democracy was broken. And we were already living in an electoral authoritarian context, as we call it in political science, or whether the fact that Biden won meant that all was fine, that the guardrails worked in some sense, that we could put this chapter behind us, in many ways tying it to Trump entirely and his time in office. And my co-author and I realized, Elizabeth Saunders and I realized, that in many ways what we had been writing about in terms of the role that democracy versus autocracy plays in the international environment was very relevant to this debate that we were having in the United States. And so some of this we published in a recent op-ed in the New York Times that I'd be happy to share if anybody's interested in taking a look at that. One of the things that I think goes underemphasized, or at least goes underemphasized in certain quarters, is that the threat to the US elections, and this is probably not a surprise to most of you, was really from the incumbent. This is a very common thing around the world, right? Is that leaders who have found themselves in office don't want to leave under any circumstances and will use bending and even breaking the rules to try to stay in office. But despite that, despite the fact that there was an incumbent in office trying to undermine democratic institutions in order to continue his hold on power, despite those efforts, US democratic practices still resulted in an authoritarian leaning incumbent losing the election. And I'm putting that in sort of non-US specific language on purpose to emphasize that globally, when you have a leader who's already in power and a political party who's already in power that's permissive of authoritarian practices, permissive of trying to use intimidation to scare voters away from elections, and is generally working and doing their best to try to scare people away from voting, and is even trying to call elected officials and pressure them into interfering in the electoral process, that often goes the other direction, right? That often works when the incumbent is trying to take things over that way. So I just want to emphasize, in comparative perspective, this is a big deal and something that I think a lot of people in my world were worried about in advance of the elections. Many of you could have heard this before. I think it's a pretty well-known thing, but in political science, one of our critical definitions of democracy, and it's a minimalist definition of democracy, hinges on transitions in power. You could have a country that has elections for a very long time, but if they continue to elect the same party or even the same leader over years and years and years, it can be hard to know whether they're really democratic. So Samuel Huntington, among other political science scholars, long ago proposed turnover, transitions in power, as a key marker of democracy and democratization. The two turnover test is sort of a famous test that you can consider a country as a democracy if it has two peaceful transitions in power in a row. And I think this minimalist conception of democracy is useful here as we begin to think about democratic backsliding. So that in the title of the talk that I proposed to you, I referenced bending without breaking. Did US democracy bend or break? And this is something that we talked about in the op-ed, this effort to apply our other global work to the US elections specifically. And one of the things that we say in that piece is critical of this sort of black and white view of US democracy. Either it's fundamentally broken, we're already in an electoral authoritarian regime, or we can now put this all behind us because the guardrails of democracy worked. And we basically think both of those viewpoints are wrong. And so what we said in the piece is, and I'll just read this quote very quickly, the problem is we've been treating Mr. Trump's attacks on democracy as if they are a pass-fail test. We should instead think of democracy as both damaged and resilient, like a forest after a powerful windstorm. And what we're trying to say with that is that we are at this moment where we think that US institutions were bent pretty far out of shape, but it is also possible that they will regain strength and could come back even stronger, but that will take some work. So by bending without breaking, I'm referring a bit to this metaphor about the forest. Another metaphor I will tell you that we played with a lot is that of a rubber band that can stretch to a certain point. If you go too far, if you bend democratic institutions too far, they will snap, right? They will break. And if you bend them too often, eventually the elasticity will begin to give. All right. My co-author was a physics major in undergrad, and she has told me that we could potentially talk about the tensile strength of democratic institutions, but we decided that political scientists probably wouldn't necessarily think that that was a very good idea. All right, so one of the things that I found also to be very enlightening came up while I was teaching in the fall. And I was teaching an undergraduate seminar called The Elections Around the World, in which we talked about a lot of the problems that occur when most countries in the world hold elections. And I wanted to also emphasize that I find this book by Adam Dworsky, who's one of the leading, leading people who writes on democracy and what we call self-enforcing democracy, who's still contributing to scholarship these days. This book is written for a popular audience. It's called Why Bother with Elections? It's a slim little volume, and I think it is absolutely brilliant. So if you're grappling with any of these issues and you're interested in reading something about it, I highly recommend this book. But I want to dive in a little deeper into what a minimalist conception of democracy means and how that can help us understand this political moment in which people are debating whether what we're experiencing is an ongoing movement towards electoral authoritarianism, significant democratic backsliding, or it's something that could be thought of as severe political conflict under democratic institutional rules. So he writes towards the end of the book, in the end, the miracle of democracy is that conflicting political forces obey the results of voting. People who have guns obey those without them. Incumbents risk their control of government offices by holding elections. Losers wait for their chance to win office. Conflicts are regulated, processed according to rules, and thus limited. This is not consensus, yet not mayhem either, just regulated conflict, conflict without killing. Ballots are paper stones. I will come back a little bit to this in a moment, but I just wanted to introduce this notion that if a lot of the optimism that I get about democracy is in thinking about elections and democracy as something that is an alternative to resolving our conflicts without a peaceful way to work through these conflicts. And sometimes elections can be somewhat violent, but even somewhat violent elections might be less violent overall than some other mechanism that a society could have for resolving disputes in the absence of something like democracy and elections. So he basically thinks that for all their problems and for all the issues associated with them, that that we are still living in a more peaceful world when we have elections and when we have democracy, even if it's undermined in many ways. Okay. So I wanted to spend a minute just outlining one very basic thing. Those who can bend democratic institutions can also work to defend them. One way that I like to teach about regime type and that I like to think about regime type, whether or not a country is democracy or is democratic or authoritarian, is that regime type defines relationships between leaders and citizens. And to the extent that they're allowed to exist in authoritarian regimes, also political parties. There are, of course, other important actors in politics, the media, the fourth estate, the judiciary. But for today, these three actors are the ones that I'm focused on as we think about threats to democracy in the United States. We often talk about them as having different political preferences. We're sort of used to thinking about political parties having different political preferences, leaders having different preferences, citizens having different preferences. But what we don't talk about a lot in the United States, and what I talk about a lot in other countries, is whether citizens, leaders, and political parties have a real preference for democracy, and whether they're willing to not only abide by the laws that would come with penalty if they didn't follow them, but whether they're supportive of a whole host of other norms that are enabling of democracy, even if those behaviors are not necessarily legally required. Relatedly, each of these actors can bend democracy for their own advantage. Of course, leaders have a disproportionate advantage, elected leaders have a disproportionate advantage to do this. Leaders can try to rig elections, they can abuse state resources for electoral gain, they can do a whole host of things to push institutions away from what one might call the status quo. Political parties can refuse to accept outcomes of elections that they lose, and they can also otherwise promote authoritarian behavior amongst their supporters. As a sort of aside, but is relevant to the reform debate, I completely buy the argument that most party members follow party cues rather than the other way around, which is a viewpoint that puts a lot more emphasis on the political party part of this picture. But in some cases, in some important cases around the world, we've seen citizens break with their parties and really lead their parties, if you will, towards different positions that are more or less democratic, generally in the democratic direction. But one of the things that I think also comes out of this framework is that all democratic institutions and all forms of democratic resilience that I can think about become undermined and become very brittle if citizens no longer care whether they live in a democracy or autocracy. To go back to the forest metaphor that I was using earlier, I think the sort of roots of this system are citizens and whether or not and how deeply they support democracy in their country. And without that, I think it's a very tenuous situation going forward. And I think that's part of what many of us are talking about right now. So I said I would talk about this in an international environment, and I want to talk about democracy versus autocracy, because I think the point about democratic resilience can be misunderstood. Democracy, and this goes back to the Dvorsky quote that I just showed you, there's a general sense both about how democracy can deal with serious internal division and or the election of incompetent leaders without a resort to violence. This is all in comparison to how authoritarian regimes tend to behave, not in comparison to what we might wish were the case or some sort of ideal type. And so why do we get to this point? Why do we argue this? One of the things that's out there in the literature and that we highlight is that democracy relies on constitutionally defined procedures for transitions in power. And compared to dictatorship, elections offer a peaceful and rule-governed way to get rid of bad leaders. I want to emphasize that I'm not trying to say that democracy guarantees the election of good leaders. It's clear from all kinds of history that elections can elect bad leaders and authoritarian leader selection processes can also create and select bad leaders. But if you end up with a bad leader in an authoritarian regime, you have to have, in most cases, a non-constitutional or extra-constitutional process to replace them, which often involves a military coup, a civil war, or assassinations. In a democracy, many of us were impatient with Trump and the damage that he was doing to democracy and other things. But the focal point was the upcoming election. People were able to channel their energies into that process with a realistic expectation that he would be replaced. I think this is somewhat depressing in a way, but for me, it's a way to feel optimistic about the ability of the US to overcome its current predicament. And also an argument to do everything possible right now to promote US democratic resilience. In case it's not clear, given I'm speaking to the Democratic Club, I'm obviously talking about small d democracy throughout this talk rather than the Democratic Party in the United States. Democratic resilience is something that I think is very interesting when viewed in light of authoritarian regimes. So one way to think about the differences, and I'm trying to make this as general as possible, but political institutions across the entire regime type spectrum, including the most authoritarian countries like North Korea or prior totalitarian regimes, all the way to whichever country you want to call the most democratic country in the world. Political institutions set the rules of the game, set the rules of the relationships between citizens, leaders, and often political parties. And importantly, especially for foreign policy and for global politics, they set the default degree to which leaders are either exposed to or insulated from citizen accountability. So very generally, democracies are more exposed to citizen accountability and autocracies are more insulated from citizen accountability. This is a point that Elizabeth Saunders and I are emphasizing in some of our joint work on this topic about regime type and international relations. We came to this not by thinking about problems with US democracy. That's where we ended up applying it. But I want to go through just a minute or two on how we got here, which is that many IR scholars, many scholars of international relations, which are my people, think democracy has numerous international advantages, including that democracies are better, they have advantages in initiating wars, in fighting wars and winning them, in coercive diplomacy, in international finance, in free trade, in economic growth, in making credible commitments in alliances and other forms of international cooperation, in foreign investment, and in respecting human rights. But one of the things that has been puzzling a lot of people in my world is that we have been seeing authoritarian leaders working to try to become more constrained by their domestic audiences. For example, we've seen the Chinese government allow lots of protests to nearly get out of hand on specific issues. And it seems almost deliberate that they're allowing their citizens to have more voice than they're accustomed to under certain circumstances. And we also see some democratic leaders around the world trying to evade some of their accountability, to basically move away from the degree to which they can be held accountable, or move around some of the domestic constraints that they normally see. We argue that there's a cost to doing this, but I think what we saw in Trump was a real pushing away from the default level of citizen accountability that would exist in the US if they were just sort of staying where they were. That he was pushing against this, trying to evade accountability for his actions, in part by just misrepresenting his actions on a regular basis and having this microphone where he could lie directly to his supporters pretty much every day. And that in some ways this allowed him to be less accountable to citizens than leaders normally are in the United States, who don't try to pay this cost. I'm going to probably not talk about this. I'm recognizing that it's later in the evening, and but for those of you that are a little bit more visual, for those of you who are not visual, just close your eyes for a second. If we think about the degree to which a leader can be held accountable to a domestic audience on the y-axis, and we think about a continuum ranging from the sort of most authoritarian government on the x-axis to the most accountable democracy on the right, on the far right of the x-axis, there's a default level of accountability that's just higher in democracies. This is part of why we think democracies have international advantages in foreign policy. And this is where institutions should, in theory, snap back to after they are bent by leaders when those leaders are out of office. These are the rules of the game. And I think that one of the things that me and my colleagues, and I hope a number of other political scientists will put our attentions to in the coming years, is trying to understand this process of moving away from the status quo. What does it cost leaders to in democracies to evade audience constraints, and what does it cost democracy? Similarly, what does it cost authoritarian leaders to open themselves up, to expose themselves in many ways to more accountability than they would otherwise experience? And what does that do to their regime type over time? Oh, I'll turn away from this figure. It's just straight from an academic journal article, which I know isn't very pretty, but it's what we ended up publishing with them. The point here is, though, that you can see behaviors across democracies and autocracies that are pretty similar by leaders without fundamentally altering the regime type, at least in the short term. And this is something that I think is often missed in our conversations about whether the US is fundamentally damaged in some sense. Of course, institutions that are bent too far will break. If a democratic leader goes too far in an authoritarian direction, or a dictator lets the protests get too out of hand, loses control, the regime type changes and it becomes a more or less more authoritarian country or more democratic country. The flip side, I think, of this is that we can be hopeful that even severely bent institutions can potentially default to this status quo level of citizen accountability. I'm going to switch gears and just briefly talk about a couple of things. And Brody, please let me know if I'm going on too long. I'm planning to go until about 7:45 initially, but I think that maybe we started a few minutes after. So just feel free to stop me. I could talk about this topic all night. One of the things that I have written about recently, and I think, Brody, this may be how you found me, is that I wrote about global trends in democratic backsliding, which we also call autocratization. It does not roll off the tongue even for me, who tries to say it all the time, or democratic erosion, which involves incremental changes away from representative democracy toward authoritarianism. And we probably saw peak democracy in the world about 15 to 20 years ago. And what we've been seeing since then is a real trend away from democracy globally. And I say that in part to say that this is not just a Trump thing, right? This is something that seems to be connected to the populist related backlash to globalization and the policies that were enacted during globalization. So this is the piece that I wrote is in this special issue that Science Magazine did on democracy. And I was invited to write a review on this topic, focusing on current trends in elections and democratic backsliding, as well as the consequences of this waning international support for democracy, which at the time that I was writing it was also just really strong headwinds originating from the US against democracy globally, where we had once supported it in many more countries in the world. Some of that may be recoverable, but I think it's a little bit too soon to say. Thinking about this trend globally, and in partly this, this is dropping the perception that this is just a US issue, this is just a US problem. The global diffusion of national elections and formal political competition is shown here. And I want to emphasize that elections are something that spread to nearly every country in the world by the early 2000s. By the end of that decade, most of them also allowed for opposition parties to exist and to compete, if not necessarily to win, as the blue line shows. The only countries, for those of you who are curious about these things, not holding national elections, meaning elections, direct elections for national office between 2010 and 2018, were Brunei, China, Eritrea, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, South Sudan, and the UAE. This in part reflects the diffusion of democracy around the world, but as some of my research documents, it also reflects the diffusion of what some of us call pseudo-democracy and electoral authoritarianism, or the superficial adoption of democratic institutions. For hundreds of years, the global value of democracy has fluctuated, in part with US support, but even prior to that. And what we're experiencing at this moment is a precipitous decline in the international value of democracy from what was its high water mark. Again, I don't know whether Biden will change this. The fact, I read a count that he actually referenced the word democracy more times in his inauguration speech than any president before him in US history, which I thought was an interesting indicator. At the same time that elections are spreading and that they continue to be held in most countries in the world, the vast majority of countries, more than 90% of countries, still holding national elections. At the same time, and not coincidentally, many scholars and entities like Freedom House have documented a global trend in democratic backsliding. So current threats, I've already mentioned this a little bit, but current threats to democracy around the world are coming from both international and domestic sources. There are internal threats to democracy in some countries, like anti-democratic political parties. And these anti-democratic political parties, while every political party is unique in the world, they often have global ties and they're learning strategies from one another. I'm super interested in this development and focus on three implications in this piece. First, although many forms of democracy assistance continue, the decline in more overt forms of democracy promotion and this rhetorical embrace by Trump of authoritarian leaders, as well as the backing away from of the European Union from a lot of their prior democracy promotion, is likely to result in an easing of pressure on elites to appear as though they are democratic. And the other thing that it does that I think is really interesting is it decreases support for mass movements that favor democracy. For those of you watching what happened in the past year in Hong Kong, I think you'll see that those hundreds of thousands of protesters were really left alone in trying to challenge their governance structure, which in 5 years previously, I think would have been met with significantly more international support for what they were doing. A second thing, and mirroring patterns in the diffusion of democracy, authoritarian practices and strategies to undermine democratic institutions are more freely diffusing across borders. And this is something that I think is also hard to track, but very interesting, which is that these anti-democratic forces are learning from each other. A third threat to democracy around the world, which is led by Russia and China, aims to undermine the international norm of democracy, as well as the legitimacy of efforts to promote democracy, in part by privileging and arguing in favor of state security over individual rights. And these are often in tension with one another. I'm just going to show just very briefly, this is also a figure from the same piece, the total number of elections held annually over time, which of course fluctuates naturally from year to year. But after steady increases throughout the post-World War II period, the number of countries holding elections annually seems to have hit a plateau and maybe in a bit of a decline. Some of this may be coming from countries that postpone elections for a little bit longer than they used to. But you can also see this bottom trend is the total number of elections that experience government harassment of the opposition or media bias that favors the incumbent. So at the same time that the total number of elections being held seems to have plateaued, the quality of these elections by at least one metric is declining, and is declining in a manner that is controlled by the incumbent government. So again, this is something that's happening globally. So where does this leave us? These are pictures of a bunch of protest movements. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this particular thing. But I want to emphasize that many people I know, and many smart people I know, are very critical of US democracy promotion efforts. I think in some ways, I noticed that it really increased following the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. In some ways, this is continuing to have a hangover from that experience, and the fact that the words democracy promotion were used to justify that invasion. But I think it's interesting to think about what will happen if the US doesn't resume a global leadership role, that it has democracy at its center. China and Russia under Trump were quite happy to step into some of that space and to work to undermine democratic institutions around the world with very little resistance from what used to be democracy's more prominent defenders. And so I think it's really interesting to think about how these very brave protest movements that we've been seeing in many countries around the world deal with, will they be as successful without external support? Will that external support increase again? Will they be able to take down dictators by themselves, really, if the support is strong enough? And I think that is relevant to our domestic conversation here as well. I'll return to this picture and say that although leaders can use institutions for their own purposes by taking advantage of their flexibility, by manipulating the degree to which they're accountable to domestic audiences, international actors can also play a role here. They can support democracy by supporting citizen movements. They can undermine democracy by attempting to undermine citizen and political party support for democracy. International actors can undermine democracy by helping leaders or political parties steal elections, which famously the US has done in its history, and Russia has also been quite active in doing this. International actors can also help support reforms aimed at improving democracy, and a lot of these things are really important. I have just 2 more slides, I think. I think I have time to do them. One of the things I've been thinking about, and I've been playing a role with some groups, including the Election Reformers Network, that's working on using this international perspective to feed into reform proposals in the United States aimed at increasing resiliency of US democracy. And one of the things they're focused on is promoting nonpartisan and more technocratic election administration in the more than 10,000 election jurisdictions that exist in the US. Of course, as I think maybe somebody, I can't read the chat while I'm talking, but I think I briefly saw that I think someone mentioned the importance of civic education. And it does seem to be the case that we need to emphasize this more, including the societal benefits of democracy. It's clear to me that if citizens basically shrug when democracy is undermined, it's not going to last for very long. There has to be this groundswell of citizen support for democracy that politicians are responsive to. Another really important thing that I've been saying a lot to various journalists and whatnot who I speak to is that there has to be a willingness to support democracy in two political parties. Right now, there's this very strong authoritarian movement within the Republican Party. And unless that's grappled with and unless support for democracy wins out, I think US democracy is going to have many, many, many more struggles ahead of it. It's very hard to have a democracy with only one political party that wants to play by the rules of the game. Of course, we can talk about electoral system reform and then the media environment, which I think is one of the most important issues to talk about, something I've been talking about a lot, but it would take up a whole another lecture to really get into that. I also wanted to just conclude with this notion. This is a picture, if you're wondering why I'm showing rubber ducks, these are Thai protesters who are protesting against some more authoritarian movement in their country, and they're using these large rubber ducks to defend protesters against rubber bullets that were being fired against them and other projectiles that the police were sending their way. So whether the US is democratic or not, in my opinion, matters well outside US borders, and it matters now, like urgently, in many countries around the world. Many citizens in other countries want external support for democracy, in part because they can't battle a repressive authoritarian government by themselves. It's very hard for unarmed citizens to do that. But they have done so successfully for many decades, in part with support from external actors. I didn't spend too much time talking about it, but I do think that the alternative frameworks for global engagement by the US are likely worse. We've seen a lot of these. They become very self-interested and often end up supporting, honestly, pretty horrific policies with US power. And I do think it's possible that we're going to be headed towards a world order in which there's a real contestation over democracy versus non-democracy, or citizen security versus state security as organizing principles. I have some conclusions and some thoughts, but I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on them. And then if there's no comments at all, I have a couple of questions that I can leave you with that are just things that I'm still thinking about. I'll stop there.
Do you want to go over these aspects on this slide?
I sure can. I wasn't sure if you guys have a firm stop at
No, we don't.
at 8 o'clock, and I needed to be hustling up because I think I spoke a little longer than I intended. So I think one of the things that I just want to leave you with is just that democracy is the most resilient system of government that we have. It's resilient to threats from parties. It's resilient to threats from leaders. If we were in an authoritarian regime, we would already be in civil war, in my opinion, right? Given the societal conflicts that we've been facing. And so yes, it's bad right now, but all of my optimism is really born out of a very strong sense of the exact ways in which it could be worse. And so I do think there's a lot to be grateful for. I do think that we should think about reforms that are focused on citizens, parties, and leaders, not just on the rule-based reforms. The rule-based reforms are definitely important, in my opinion, But I think we need to go beyond driving with the rear view mirror, which is an article title that I love from a political science article that has nothing to do with this. But it's basically referring to this tendency that we have to fix the last problem without trying to anticipate what's likely to be the next problem. And so we have to have reforms, but those reforms need to be made with a strong sense of all of the things that could go wrong that are perhaps more serious and more significant than the things that did go wrong in this past cycle. Finally, some people are sort of indifferent about democracy. They're very focused on their own issues and also on winning against their political foes, winning at all costs. And from my perspective, I think I'd like more people to be willing to believe in and support democracy, not just because it's good politics or something like that, but also because it's really good foreign policy to be a democracy. We're better off as a democracy, and we're better off with more democracies as international partners. And so there's lots of things related to this that I think are really interesting. I can leave this slide up for a second. I think it's really interesting to watch the negotiations that are ongoing within the Republican Party. I again say this as a non-Americanist. I've been in the room with a lot of Republicans lately that have been active in trying to people like Evan McMullen and folks from the Lincoln Project, and that they're really pushing for the Republican Party to move away from this authoritarian wing and to quash it. And I don't know if they can do it, but I sure hope that they can, because it's really important, not just for issues that I care about, but for the survival of our democracy. The other thing that I'm spending a ton of time thinking about and talking to others about, and that we're probably going to be doing some events at Berkeley in the near future about, is just whether the current media and informational environment is a fundamental threat to democracy, not just in the United States, but globally. Theorists of democracy have not spent a huge amount of time talking about this. I think that the last question I'll leave you with before I turn to the chat and people have put their hand up is just whether we can reform fast enough and rebuild democratic resilience fast enough to withstand the next stress test. Because I think, in my mind at least, this is an ongoing sort of existential threat to US democracy. And I don't want to depress everyone. To me, I have optimistic things to say, but I know for people who don't spend their time thinking about this all the time, it can come across as a little bit depressing. So I know there's some questions. So Bertie, I'll turn it back to you, I guess.
Thank you very much. If you could go back to your other slide, because someone asked, you mentioned citizen reforms. So what kind of citizens reforms? What do you mean about that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I don't mean reforming citizens, but I do think that civic education aimed at support for democracy would be something that we want to focus on. I think parties, I think the Democratic Party also needs to do this, not just the Republican Party, but to sort of emphasize support for democracy as part of their work, because we are at this moment of critical threat, and that would be aimed at citizens, right? It would be sort of messaging aimed at partisans and potentially nonpartisans. And then I also think the way people consume information is really critical. I don't know what the solution is, but I do think there's something broken right now with the fact that my phone tells me what it thinks I want to read about the news, and that I go and read those stories, right? And that we lack this thing now that used to be thought of as essential to democracy, going back to, for example, Seymour Martin Lipset or some of these early thinkers of early theorists of democracy and modern democracy, thinking about US democracy as well, is just that part of this depends on our ability to consume information that we reasonably think is truthful. And there's just a whole, I don't know how to get to the people who are living in these truth-free bubbles. But I do think that's one of the more important challenges to democracy right now.
We plan to have a speaker about that, about how to regulate the media in the future.
Oh, great. Yes. I've been talking about that to a lot of people. Yes.
Here's another question in chat. Is it Republicans or Wall Street that uses them as their agent? In other words, money out of politics.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many reforms that U.S. democracy needs, and I don't, I wouldn't call myself an expert in all of those reforms, right? I think that, but I will say that one of the pieces I wrote in the fall was looking at the report that international election observers wrote about the U.S. elections. So they were here from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. They've been here since 2002, coming to observe US elections. And that was their number one thing, right? That was one of their top headline problems with US elections, is the inordinate amount of money in US politics that would really horrify citizens in almost any other country in the world, right? That they couldn't believe. It's a really interesting report if folks
We
are interested in
had
that.
Lawrence Abbott speak to us tonight about how to get rid of Citizens United.
Yes, I was here for that. Yes, that was great. Thank you. I learned a lot.
Here's a question: should we do away with the filibuster?
I mean, gosh, these Senate rules are, I'm not an expert in Senate rules nor the history of Senate rules, but I do think that there's lots of reasons to be worried about Congress, generally speaking, and the degree to which they've become hyper partisan, hyper polarized, and lost the ability to pass legislation on a regular basis, which some people say was intended. I don't know. I've seen arguments that are somewhat persuasive both ways. I feel like I'm not going to be able to offer an academic opinion that's informed on that. I can just give you my personal opinion.
If we have the filibuster, then it's really the rule by minority instead of the rule of majority.
Well, but supermajority required to, I mean, defeat filibuster is also not ruled by majority. It's ruled by supermajority, which is also not done.
Well, but the minority gets to have their say, because if they can't get a supermajority, the minority rules.
What I'd rather see, honestly, is electoral reform that leads us towards. Matthew Shugart is one of my professors in graduate school. Is a professor at UC Davis, also someone you could probably have in to your session. Is written quite persuasively about the possibility of electoral reform in the United States, moving us towards a more like a mixed member proportional system that he thinks is actually realistic, at least for the House, and that might lead us to more constructive policy.
I'm going to go to some of the ones we had before the meeting. Let's see. A democracy needs accurately informed voters. Should there be stronger laws about disseminating lies and conspiracy theories? Well, I think we just sort of talked about that, didn't we?
Yeah.
Oh, but we wanted to ask you, what is it like in other countries? Do they have laws against conspiracy theories? How do they handle that?
So, I mean, it depends. Certainly, post-war Germany had some serious control over the types of information that could be shared within their democratic political space. And a lot of that was externally influenced as well. I will tell you that this issue that I raised about the media is pervasive globally. Nearly all countries are having problems with misinformation. Why? Because it's not just domestically sourced misinformation. International actors are also deliberately, China and Russia are deliberately, Iran apparently too, undermining democracy and attempting to influence specific elections, but more generally just trying to sow a little bit of chaos within specific democratic elections.
Are authoritarian nations like Venezuela or something, do they still have that problem, or is that just not
Venezuela,
or other authoritarian, nations?
Oh, authoritarian. They
control
don't have the same problem. The thing that they seem to be dealing with and citizens seem to be grappling with the most there is surveillance states. So it's kind of connected, but it's a different extreme, which is rather than citizens being able to say whatever they want, even if it's false, and to a massive audience, even if it's not clear, their citizens are being watched in everything that they say in a very 1984 sort of Orwellian way. And those trends towards surveillance are spreading as well. So I think it's a similar issue. It's connected to the same technology, but it's really state security winning out over any sense of individual rights, in my view.
Right, but they could still read things on the internet, and then does the government try to control that?
Yeah. There's a lot of countries that have internet controls. Uganda, for example, just had an election, and there's ways in which they use selective keywords around specific topics on the elections and try to control the media. And in some countries, they just shut down the media, or I'm sorry, the internet in advance of the election.
Yeah, I think someone else is talking about their friends only, their Christian friends will not even look at ABC, CBS, or NBC News. Okay, let me see what else we have here.
I see someone raising their actual hand. Should I tell you that, Brody? It's Nancy Powers.
Can you type it in chat, Nancy? Okay, let's see if we have any back here. What would that, if you had electoral reform, how do you deal with gerrymandering? What would that entail? Obviously, stop the gerrymandering.
Yeah, so one of the proposals for electoral reform has to do with the creation for House races of multi-member electoral districts, which are districts that are larger and that elect, say, 5 representatives from one district that are allocated proportionally based on a larger than that unit vote share. So it's a really interesting system. I encourage you, I think it would be a good topic for this. But the gerrymandering is in some ways ruled out because the districts grow significantly. And so the gerrymandering kind of gets subsumed into these larger multi-member districts.
So if you had multi-member people, would that allow for more political party like the Green Party or the other parties to be able to get voted in?
Yeah, so if you had, for example, I'm just making this up to make the numbers easier, but if you had a multi-member district with 10 representatives, you could have many more parties, or you could have 2 parties in one very small party, but it would probably eventually move towards a few parties, 3 or 4, maybe even 5, and you would have distribution, maybe 3 representatives from one party, 3 from another party, and you could have, a handful of small parties, each win a seat, depending on how votes are distributed. But the seats are assigned based on who gets the highest proportion of votes in the much larger district.
This one's sort of rambling on, but let's see if we can get to the question. The fact that one man and his minions were able to pass along so many lies because it manifests itself. What is the probability that as many 40+ million people possibly believe this? If these lies, even when presented with facts, the worst being the election, is fraudulent. So how does the government handle that?
So I think it's the Republican Party who has to handle that. It's very hard for anyone else to do that. I think that the social media environment has dirt on their hands, so to speak, in a significant way. But the thing that I could reference this in passing during my talk, but I'm a true believer in this notion that citizens follow elite cues. They follow political party cues. And it's going to be very hard for anyone to counter this disinformation campaign by Trump and by the Republican Party with arguments about facts, right? And to say you're wrong, here's the facts, and here's how here's who you should be listening to. The whole campaign is designed around generating mistrust about those facts, right? So it's very hard to imagine a world in which they're going to be persuaded by objective information out of this conspiracy theory world position. I do think that it's possible that there's something to be learned from. So I think the Republican Party could do it, right? If they win, if the battle by the pro-democracy wing of the Republican Party is able to be won by them, then I think that could do it. I think most people will go along with it. People parrot party lines. It's very reliable in research, right? I think that there's just a huge amount of evidence to suggest that regular citizens will mostly go along with party cues most of the time. So it's very hard to undo it. Now there's another group of people that seem a little bit more like cult followers or something like that. And so I think there's a different evidentiary base to draw on for that. And Brody, you might know about that. You said you had a PhD in psychology, I think you said in email, but you know, I don't know how to break people out of those worlds, but I do think that that might be the appropriate direction to look rather than persuasion and democracies, right? I just don't think that that's what an important subset of it is about.
If Trump does form a patriot party where all his patriots go, could there be 3 political parties, do you think, or not?
I mean, in political science, it's a pretty strong set of research findings that suggest that we have the number of political parties that we have in every country around the world because of our electoral system. And so it's the electoral system and the rules of the game that create 2 parties, not the other way around, right? The 2 parties don't come first, they come after the system that we have. The single member district, first past the post, all of this stuff. So if we want 3 parties, to me, we have to move towards proportional representation. There's just no way to get there without that. The US, the temporary situation though is one that could happen, which is that in the short term, the Republican Party could split into 2. And then very quickly they would realize that that's a losing strategy because it's the same group of people split into two groups running against each other. And so they would just probably not win as much as they hope to, which might then change the dynamic.
This is from Barbara Blaylock. How important do you believe domestic grassroots movements are in the current environment, such as Indivisible?
I actually don't know. This is where my status as a non-Americanist becomes quite glaringly obvious, which is that I don't know about all of these grassroots movements in the United States as much as I should. But generally speaking, I think we've gone through a period in which a lot of that diminished, and then we're now at this moment of resurgence for a lot of these grassroots movements. And so I'm hopeful that the pro-democracy ones become more active, and that a lot of these grassroots movements also become more inclusive, and that work to make U.S. politics more inclusive of all types of voters. I think that that's a major reform that we also need to see.
Here's sort of a long question, comes from Kathy Herbalis. Congressional procedures have made the body incapable of work. Presidents see that Congress has vanished, so enact non-durable short-term legislation through executive orders. As each new president is inaugurated, the country swings in one direction once again. Democracy has left Washington, D.C. Can we expect this change, or should we recognize that the country has become a wobbly autocracy and turn our emphasis to state governments?
Well, that's a big question. I suppose given what I've said today, I would come down on the position that a minimalist conception of democracy is fine for me, fine for my purposes, in that we have elections that can result in transitions in power still. And to me, that is like a fundamental bright line, that as long as we have that, governance issues are a sort of a thing that is separate from democracy or not. Right? They're very important, but how Congress works to me is very different from whether or not we're a democracy in a sort of minimalist sense. So in part, like, I'm just dodging the question because I think it's a very difficult one. But I do think that part of it is just, this is what it looks like when you have a divided society with very different preferences. I also think, I didn't say this in my talk, but one thing that just I cannot get out of my mind is that something a fellow political scientist said on Twitter, which was that what we're experiencing now is US democratizing at last, and the backlash against that. So by making all of these movements toward greater political representation for African Americans and for other people of color in the United States, the white nationalists found their president and have been pushing back against that because they do not want to have a democracy in the United States that represents all citizens. So I know that's not quite the question that was asked, but I do think that that might be kind of related to the polarization that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, yeah. So what we saw on January 6th, have you seen other nations undergone that same thing that happened here?
I,
I mean,
I
are there?
I do think that, yes. I mean, while I was watching it, so there's two observations I have. One of them is while I was watching it, I had the very strong sense that it looked a lot like footage I've seen of auto golpes, military coups, just the sort of rush on a government building, the people trapped inside, the weapons, the snipers on the roof, like all of the things that we were seeing, I think were reminiscent to me of those sorts of things in other countries. The strange thing, there's a lot of strange things about it, but I'll sort of dodge the question and say something slightly different, which is just that I have been worried about that day since the day that Trump became elected, with his polarizing rhetoric and his support for a lot of the things that again, we've already been talking about. And so the other feeling I had while watching it was this strange and sort of disturbing feeling of relief that finally this thing that I have been worried about for four plus years has happened. And I was very grateful that that didn't happen on election day. So I have also seen that type of thing happen on election day, and that is far worse.
Where did that happen? What? Give us some more. Give us some examples in other countries of what happens that are extreme.
Well, so yeah, I mean, one example is not exactly on election day, but in Pakistan, in advance of the 2008 elections that I was there for, the leading opposition candidate, Benazir Bhutto, was assassinated. Because she was doing so well in challenging the ruling party, and so that wasn't just an accident, right? She was assassinated. There's other countries that have experienced, like the Ugandan election that just happened was, not. There were parts of it where the violence and intimidation that we saw on January 6th was aimed at supporters of a specific political party, right? And we've seen that several elections in a row in Kenya. We've certainly seen that happen in Bangladesh over and over and over again, a place where I've done some field work. We've recently seen it in as some of these long-serving authoritarian leaders have decided that they're no longer going to face the same international penalties, they're doing it more overtly. So Cambodia, another country I've done some work in, the Hun Sen is just more overt in his willingness to target his political opponents, and will often detain people who are members of other opposition parties, even elected officials, and accuse them of invented charges. So that's something that they deal with on a regular basis.
Kenya authoritarian?
No.
Oh, okay, but you've seen the violence and.
Well, not personally, but yes, they have had very violent elections. Yeah, and they under very democratic systems. There's other. The Philippines, when they were more democratic, still had a lot of election violence. Bangladesh had election violence under democracy, if that's what you're asking.
But were they groups of people that had decided to rebel against the government? Like ours was. Well, ours.
No, I mean, there's a lot. The reason why the U.S. is unique, I think, is because of this history of slavery and the sort of white nationalist movement that's emerging within the Republican Party, and the fact that they felt empowered to try to disrupt the elections. That's uniquely American. I mean, there's just nothing about that I can think of a parallel to any other country.
Richard, I've been reading my notes. Do you see any other questions here?
Well, did you read the one from Nancy?
No.
It says other countries have systems in place for grade school children to learn how to vet what they are seeing online and in other media. Is this catching on in the U.S. education system?
Because I've been following this issue pretty closely, I've noticed that a lot of librarians in the United States view this as part of their educational role. I don't know if we have any school librarians in the house this evening, but I know that that their association, I think, has taken on this issue more than any other American educational group nationally, and that's something that they're working on. But I mean, it's so pervasive, and it's so uncontrolled.
Another one from Elisa O'Hare. It seems like it would be in the Republican senators' best interest to convict Trump, especially if they, my comment, especially if they want to run for president. Wouldn't their constituents move on if the whole Senate voted against Trump and he wasn't an option?
I think that they would experience some short-term penalty. But honestly, I think that in the long run, so if you think about the Nixon, impeachment and then resignation, there's some interesting parallels, which is that apparently, I wasn't of political age when that happened, but from what I've read, a lot of people at that moment believed that the Republican Party was done for a while, right? That they had to like go off and stay out, basically that they were discredited such that they couldn't win for a while because of his behavior. I don't know if that matches others' perceptions, but that's definitely something I've read. And what happened instead was that there was room for Reagan to emerge, right? And that in some ways the space for someone like him, who was really articulating a really different vision for the Republican Party, was able to kind of emerge and win over a lot of people. And so I do think there's a world in which getting rid of Trump and then allowing the ushering in of other Republican politicians, perhaps not the ones that were elected in the Trump way, in the last midterm elections, they're not going to be the ones who support this, of course. But senators, I mean, I would hope that some of them would be willing to stand up for democracy in the United States above their fear of what Trump is going to say about them on social media, or Trump supporters are going to say about them on social media. I do think they are getting threatened, and lots of bad things are happening to the ones who have come out against them. And I don't know how I would deal with that personally, to be honest. People are threatening my family, for example.
Yeah.
There was one that democracy depends on an educated electorate. So now we would seem to have a low level of government education, as well as a huge distortion that is coming from social media. Seems we have to handle both of those to have a vibrant democracy.
Mm-hmm. I'll just agree with that. Yes. But historically, you can have democracy with pretty low levels of education. But it does require there to be some focal point places that are disseminating true information, that those folks can sort of turn to for cues about how they should. And that can be just strong political parties, but it doesn't work if the political parties are anti-democratic themselves.
Do we have any more questions? No?
I see this one that's from Jim. I feel that the one silver lining in this challenging time is that people around the world in democracies, or who want to live in democracies, are very concerned about our democracy. Our experiment is important to other countries.
Yes, absolutely.
What are some of the other countries that look to us, look to our democracy to see how it's doing? Besides, is it just Europe, or are there other countries?
Oh no, I mean, I think some large multi-ethnic, multiracial countries definitely look to the US model. I think that I'd like to rephrase it slightly and say that the thing that they're looking to us for, and that I think is like a good example actually, is the struggle, right? That democracy is not just an on-off switch that you flip on and then it's on forever, that you have to continuously sort of renew it, and that the support for it has to continue, and you can't just continue to have, to take it for granted. And so in that, I do think some other countries are looking towards us. I don't actually know how to answer the question with proper nouns without just making some assumptions. So I guess my fact-based research-oriented head doesn't want to answer your question because I'm not 100% sure. But I do think that, if you look, for example, at Belarus or something like that in the protest movement that's been ongoing there, it's clear that that's something that the US would have been supporting very overtly. Now, in the same week that the US elections were being contested, Pompeo was going around trying to pressure other losing incumbents to accept defeat in elections. And I can't remember which countries exactly, but I think there was 2 other countries that had elections that were proximate. And it's just not credible for him to do, right? It just wasn't credible for him to pressure other countries.
Why would he do that? Because he wants
That's what normally does, but I don't think he quite realized how the optics of it, or if he did, he didn't care.
Okay. What about like Ukraine? Is Belarus sort of like Ukraine? They have a semi.
Belarus has been living under the same dictator for a very long time. It's called Europe's last dictatorship. And they've had this just really incredible protest movement after their more recent elections. That I think that the president did say he was going to leave office, but I don't know if that has changed at all. I haven't seen anything suggesting that. I can't remember what date he stated that he would leave on, but it was a future commitment to leave office, and a recognition that he took things too far in terms of stealing elections. In general, I think a lot of people also saw the nonviolent civic, civil rights movements and took inspiration from those. There was a lot of diffusion of those globally. One of my friends and someone I've known for a long time is a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, which I guess they've changed their name potentially too, but she has worked on the diffusion of nonviolent protest movements and has shown that they're actually more successful when they're nonviolent. And I think a lot of that goes back to the civil rights movement in the US and the nonviolent arguments that came out of that, the debate over the use of violence in those movements.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hyde. We really enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for coming to our club.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it, and thank you all for staying around.
Okay. If there's anyone else that would like to stay at our meeting and ask questions of me about our club or what we aim to do, that's great. And Dr. Hyde, thank you again.
Thank you very much. I'll leave you guys to your business. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now I can't.
Okay, now we can all unmute.
Thank you all.
Does anybody need them to unmute me? I mean, need me to unmute them? Does anybody have any reactions or any other suggestions about what they want to aim to do?
I still think that the education system doesn't adequately address these issues. As I said in some of my comments, I tell people all the time who have no idea that the judicial system is a branch of government. They think it's some department of something. I talk to people who live in the outskirts of our state. They're not getting any education. And the teachers who are teaching believe this stuff, so how can the students not believe it? And there's really no oversight out there.
What we should do is we should write a letter to Tony Thurman, who is the California State Person of Education. And we should do something like that. Would anyone like to take on that project? And we could have everyone in our club sign on to that. Would anyone like to write a letter to Tony Thurman? Because right now the education is really left up to the individual school districts. I think, isn't that true?
It's a great project. I don't want to take it on as the leader, but I want to be on the project.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, because we have a nice person that we like that's in that capacity at the state level. So maybe we could get something done.
It's certainly a need. I mean, the kids are
I hear you.
just as much as their parents.
Yeah, so no takers, huh? Come on. It's just a letter.
Go for it, Nancy.
We're
Nancy.
snowshoeing next week. My retirement day is Monday.
Oh, okay, there we go.
I'll call a meeting and see what emerges.
A meeting, I don't, it's hard enough to get everyone at a meeting right now.
Yes.
I had 63 people sign up, but only 44 are here because they don't know how to do the registration link and get the confirmation email and everything. So, yes.
I think we can work on that.
Does anybody have any questions about that? Did anybody have any trouble signing in?
When did this new part of registering and getting the link that way?
That's how we've always done it.
Well,
Oh, no,
no,
not in the beginning, maybe about the last 3 months, the last 3 meetings. Yes.
Oh.
Because that way,
I
people,
put video so she could see.
if people have registered, then I can send them a confirmation email again very easily, but they have to register. And all they have to do is click that link, and then I have access to that, to their email, and I can send out the confirmation email the day of the meeting. That's all you have to do.
To make it bigger though, Brody, it's hard to find it on the page. I mean, I've been doing Zoom meetings for, I guess, the last year or so, but you somehow draw arrows, whatever, big type, I mean, huge type, and say, click here. That's all it is, because it is quite simple when you set it up. But
I know
look
that
at the
some
page.
people don't click until the day of the meeting. So I put in bold, register in advance.
But make it big bold. I'm serious, big bold with arrows. And then the same thing when you send out your follow-up today, which allowed me to click into the meeting.
Yeah.
You look at the thing, it's really hard to find.
I would have to agree. I felt the same on the follow.
There was a second link for international, and that seemed to, that was the first one I clicked on, and it
Yeah.
was no good. So I had to go up higher. So I had the link that you had was just the one that said "click me," as opposed to the one that I'm normally used to go on a Zoom call.
That's the confirmation email. I have no control over that. Zoom sends that out. I have no control.
Well, usually when I get those, it's right at the top.
Yeah.
This wasn't.
It was not.
Sometimes
This
click to join.
was-
Click to join. Yeah.
It sounds like Richard was saying that you guys, or somebody was saying that you could fix this. So it makes it easy to find, including the sign up.
That's,
You know,
that's my
Santa Claus
that's
never
the
hears.
registration link. When I send I send the registration link out.
Right. So
I can
Yeah.
change that, but I can't change the
I
confirmation.
think if people just register and then there's a final reminder sent out to those people that have registered, that'll work, because the problem is if I've always had to go back I get so much email that I can't even find it.
yes, me too.
Reminder of the day of or the day before, then it'll be a lot easier, I think.
I did. I sent to all those 27 people who registered in advance. I was able to send the registration, the actual meeting link, confirmation email. I think I sent around 5:30 or 10 till 6.
Oh,
Yeah.
Thank you for doing that. Thank you for doing that, Brody. That helped me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I wanted to tell you that the newsletter is great. It's just getting better and better. Thank you for that.
Oh, good. Yeah, there's a lot going on. I'm trying to put some action items in from Indivisible, where we call our senators and everything. Does anybody have any other action items that they'd like me to include?
the thing about
I'm
Diane-
just drafting my letter right now to Diane Feinstein. I'm telling her that when she moved into the mayoral desk, I was at law school at Hastings. And that was, a major deal that a woman was going to move into that position, even though it was because of the death of Moscone and
Mhm.
that whole thing. But I'm inviting her to join me for a retirement tea party.
that's great.
What a good idea. That'll get her thinking.
Can we all come? to the Zoom meeting?
She might really like it.
I'm gonna have a party later on when everybody's vaccinated and we're all in better shape. And it's gonna be a masquerade party because we have to wear masks. And I can still dance to Great Balls of Fire.
I don't know. I'm getting tired of masks.
Nancy, I'm looking forward to it.
I am too.
Honesty, what can you do about Diane?
Anyway, I need to leave, Brody. Thank you so much for putting this on. This was just excellent. Once again, good night, everyone.
Hi, Nancy.
Bye, Nancy.
Bye.
Hi,
Bye.
Tika.
Thank you for coming.
So what can you do about Diane Feinstein?
Oh, you should repeat what you said before, Brody, because many people were not online when you said what you said.
Yeah, you were muted during part of that.
What about what can we do about getting
Write a
Diane?
letter. Tell her, ask her to please resign.
Yeah.
Explain to her that she can go out on her record, preserving her legacy right now.
Yeah.
Would Newsom just put in another Democrat, right?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Does it work if she retires between now and 2022? Can the governor appoint someone, or
The
do we
governor
wait for the
appoints-
next election?
The governor appoints someone.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't hear what you said, Brody.
Oh, the governor does appoint someone.
So we want her to retire now before she goes into a coma and there's no procedure.
Yeah.
There's no procedure if someone's, if
Oh, yeah.
Brody, you're talking. If someone's in a coma and they're a member of the Congress, they're just in a coma and they're a member of Congress till the next election. That's dumb. We need her vote. We need her to quit now. And
She's just not responsive anymore.
no, well, when she hugged Lindsay, that was the end of it for me. And also I have a friend who's well connected in Washington, D.C., who had an appointment with her and she didn't show.
Would anyone like to write that?
It was an ABA board member, so American Bar Association, and she just wasn't there.
Mm.
And the head of her party, though, I mean, be talked to? Can we be sending a joint? I mean, maybe you could write a letter and all of us, whoever wants to, could sign it.
Right.
And then go to Pelosi or Schumer or whoever and say, you must know, obviously these people know that she's a problem. It can't be just you all knowing that.
Our staff must know.
But so much the people in the Senate who are dealing
I
with
think when Schumer took her aside when she hugged Lindsay, he said he had a very strong discussion with her. She probably doesn't remember it, but sorry.
Jeez.
But it's.
Well, if someone writes a letter, we will all sign it. I can put it.
Well, my letter is more from me to her.
Yes, I understand. Yes. And you're writing the other letter too, correct?
Letter.
Hey,
Who's volunteering? I'm not a writer of letters. I'm not.
Okay.
I'm a visual person.
How about one of our new members? We've got Shirley Freeman here and Taneki.
Tinica. Tinica is here.
Tinica, yes. Would you like to write the letter?
I'm just listening and enjoying this talk, and it puts new ideas in my head. But I would support this endeavor, somebody writing a letter and signing it.
Shirley Freeman, are you good at writing letters? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I am, but as I said, I'm here to just see how everything goes for a while. I don't want to just participate just yet.
Okay. Patty Lynn, you're a new member. Would you like to write a letter? Maybe she's not listening here right now. Okay.
She has her.
I'm here.
Oh, okay.
I'm here. I was having dinner. I didn't want to have everybody
Right.
watch me
No,
eat.
I understand. Would you like a letter?
No, I will take on the next project. Right
Okay.
now, I'm trying to draft a letter to Newsom about the eviction moratoriums. So
That's a great idea.
yeah, I'm kind of immersed in that right now, but I will get involved with the letter for the next one.
Well, we would be glad to sign on to that letter if that would be something that you would like.
Okay, let me keep that in mind. Thank you.
I'd like to ask Tinica a question. So you're a world traveler. You were born in another country. You've lived in many places. When I talked about education, what's the story in countries that you have lived in and you've known the education system? Do they teach how their government works?
Well, I cannot say that they do. I cannot say that they do. I think maybe in the universities they might, but I know that in high school, I certainly didn't learn very much about my government in the Netherlands. No. So I think they do a better job here to teach people how their government works.
So you raised 4 girls here in this education system, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And you felt that they got a better education on civics?
Well, no. Well, at least when I first came to this country and I went to college, we had units that you had to take in political science, and that's where I got my education about how the U.S. government works, which was very good. I mean, it was not perfect, but I mean, it was an introduction, and then everybody has to learn more on their own. But yeah.
You should know that Tinica and I have been on motorcycle trips to San Jose del Cabo, Glacier National Park, and a lot of other things.
Oh my goodness.
Oh,
fun. Here.
Fun.
You know, Patty, when you mentioned you were going to write Governor Newsom about the eviction moratorium,
Yeah.
hasn't he come up and said, okay, we're going to prevent all new oil drilling on public lands, or is that somebody else?
I don't know.
President said that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we need to, I mean, he didn't include fracking. And we need someone to be active on that too.
But he did permit a lot of new oil drilling.
Oh, that's what it was. Yes.
That's me. It's really, I've got it in my craw, about that. And that we are the only state where there's oil drilling, where we don't tax the oil that comes out of the ground.
Right.
And that's one of my causes right now.
Are you going to write a letter about that? We could all participate.
Well, I'm going to call Rebecca Bauer-Kahan about it, because she's an environmental attorney. And I also called, I forget his name right now, but there was a bill in California to tax oil companies when they produce oil from our land, and it didn't pass. And so I've got to call Wikowski. Wikowski is the state senator. So I called and left a message, but I haven't heard anything. But I think we need to know about that.
Who's the senator from Southern California? Holly something?
Well, it sure sounds like the oil industry has got control of our government here in the state. But they were stupid enough not to have taxes all these years.
Well, that dinner that Gavin Newsom went to was sponsored by an oil industry lobbyist.
Working for America.
I forgot about that.
And this is Mark Cammons, and I came late, and I don't know why, but there's a real Richard Adler, and then I'm an imposter Richard Adler. I don't know how I got labeled Richard Adler. I didn't put that in.
Because I sent a link out from Richard's confirmation email, and then you used that confirmation email. I didn't know it was going to change your name.
Okay, well, anyway, Richard, I'm not trying to impose, I'm Mark.
Yeah, good to meet you, Mark.
Yeah, good to meet you, Mark.
How to spell your name?
M-A-R-K.
Maybe Mark would like to write the letter.
Like to do what?
Yes.
I'm trying to still cure 20 million people, including 8 billion with COVID. So I'm kind of focused on medicine right now and trying to get long COVID figured out. And if anyone's not heard of it, there's something called fluvoxamine. And if you're getting a vaccine, go do it. But if you're not eligible yet, there's something called fluvoxamine that seems to give you a very mild course if you take it early. And it's very low cost, but it's not a standard approved thing yet.
They're
So we're
saying
trying
that the Regeneron cocktail can also provide protection.
That's possible too. Yeah, but this fluvoxamine, a guy, Steve Kirsch and other people have done studies. There's a large 800-person trial going on University of Washington now, but the first ones show that it's very rare side effect, one nausea, and the people, one person was on it getting better and better and better, and they said, oh, you're not supposed to be taking that, and then they took it away. They got much worse and died, but all the others who had it got much better very quickly and very mild course to where, and it was done at Golden Gate Fields for an epidemic there. And it looks quite good, but it's one of those, as long as you're not taking an SSRI, whatever that is, sort of is officially an antidepressant medicine, but it's repurposing at I think a fairly low dose, and it's very dramatic. So I asked 2 of my doctors to get a prescription, haven't heard back, probably be denied, but I'm kind of lobbying because I know someone who developed this, and they feel they're being hidden away by NIH, and all the CDC are ignoring this, quite good medicine.
How do you spell that? Spell it.
Fluvoxamine, fluvoxamine.
And that's for COVID?
Yeah, it's originally for something else, but for COVID, it looks like it's a very good treatment, and they're doing a bigger study. So that'll someday be done, but I'm thinking June. In the meantime, I know some people are looking to have it as a back. Now, if you're getting the vaccine, go for that. But if you get it and you're not eligible for vaccines, and it ends up with the ERs all full and they won't even come get you, it sounds like it's got a good chance of saving you.
Did you say it was an antidepressant?
That's the official, I believe. I'm not a doctor, but there's a guy who they basically did a very brilliant computer scientist funded $1 million of his own, matched up to 5 million by others in the Bay Area, to do artificial intelligence looking at all the approved drugs out there and what based on biochemistry might work. And then they tried this one as a leading contender. And in 2 studies, it looks like everyone did well. And other people didn't.
I'm sorry.
Was anyone on Mark DeSaulniers' meeting about COVID today? He had a town hall.
Yeah, I'm in Swalwell's territory, but I've attended DeSaulniers too, but I missed that. I actually missed the meeting notice tonight until it was already going because I had other things going on. So somehow I have trouble sometimes. This wasn't on my calendar, and usually it would be, but maybe I blew it too. So
just a side note with what he's talking about, there was a huge article. I don't know if I saw it in the Wall Street Journal or it was on the, no, it was two specialists who were being interviewed on Amoforeign Company. And they're talking about the fact that the Mayo Clinic has a concierge clinic. And what they're doing is that people who have COVID, who aren't sick, this is what they're saying, go to the clinic and they give them one of those little oxygen meters. You can get them at the store for like $25.
Yeah.
And they send them home. They're saying that the minute you have a change in your oxygen, don't wait. They said, when you get COVID, go to the hospital, get the checkout. If they send you back home, get the little meter. And the minute you changes, he said, whatever the changes, go back to the hospital and start demanding the Regeneron cocktail and monoclonal. I forgot how to pronounce that.
Yeah, monoclonal antibodies, but there's limited capacity for that. I don't know how many doses are available for that, whereas fluvoxamine's been around forever.
Right.
So,
Well, the thing is that you're saying,
little gadget. How do we go to the pharmacy and get an oxygen meter?
it's a little close on your finger. Yeah, I can go show you mine, but it's 20.
Pulse oximeter, pulse oximeter,
Oh, it's on your finger. Goes over
Yeah.
your finger. Oh,
And
like
they-
25, 30 bucks.
Yeah, and the hospitals are starting to give them out now. When they send COVID patients home and they're saying, the minute you start showing a drop in your oxygen level, your body doesn't know how sick you are. You think you're okay, you think you're breathing, maybe having a little trouble, but the oximeter shows that you're changing. And go right back and ask for help and get help. They said that the percentage of people that died that didn't do this was 30%. That was just 30% that died. But many of them are still on oxygen. Only 1% that was sent home with oximeter, I'm saying, so died. So that's a huge group of people that survived and recovered very quickly because they were getting help immediately. They said, you don't realize that you have pneumonia growing in your chest. You don't think there's anything going on. And that's what this thing shows right away. So
very good.
You know, I didn't know, I wish I'd said something earlier. Well, it wasn't my business to interrupt, but I don't know if there's a way to get a note out to the members and say, listen, here's an alternative. Just protect yourself. Get this advice.
I have to limit what I say. I
know,
could
but-
give a lot of advice about a lot of things.
Yeah, so, well, this is deadly.
Does anyone have any ideas for topics of future meetings of what they'd like to see or speakers?
Social media.
Yes, we're working on that one. Yes.
I'd like to have somebody talk about Prop 19 and how we can change it.
With a ballot measure, I don't want to go around and have gather signatures to have a ballot measure, but why don't you look
I'm
into
not
it?
asking the person to do that. You said, what do you want to have a discussion? I would like to have a discussion about Prop 19 so that people understand what it means, which is bad.
We did have a discussion on all the propositions. So do you?
Wait, we did, but we didn't discuss the real issues in 15 and 19. Nobody did.
Would you like to find a speaker on that?
No, I don't have time. I'm going snowshoeing. After 42 years, I am done.
Okay.
Done. And that was my 4th career.
Okay, I'm trying to think of where I would go to look for a speaker on Proposition 19.
You just asked for ideas. I'm giving you an idea.
Yeah.
And it's very complicated, as you may know, that people weren't aware that it basically, if you die, your kids can't necessarily easily inherit the house and still have the old tax rate, things like that, which is quite dramatic.
It's very dramatic. I've been working on it for the last 15, 20 years, helping many families who otherwise would have lost that opportunity. And lawyers didn't know about it. CPAs didn't know about it. Nobody knew about it who was advising people. They said, sell the house. There goes your biggest asset. So
in our meeting on propositions, we did have we did point that out. That was one of the things we pointed out in that proposition. I remember. And maybe we could go to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They talk about propositions there, or they did.
Okay.
How about what kind of things in climate change are y'all interested in?
It's urgent.
Yeah. Okay. So
I mean,
I'll try and draft a letter to who's the one who said that was it you, Sheila, that Newsom has approved what 6 or 8 new oil drills?
Many. It was in the Chronicle. It was shocking.
Yes.
He's allowing more drilling.
Yeah.
It's horrifying.
Yeah. I'll try and write a letter to that to Governor Newsom about that, and we can all sign that.
That would be very, very good.
A couple of years ago, we had, they're doing oil drilling in Brentwood, and they're okaying us. They're doing it within 750 feet of a home.
Oh my gosh.
That's ridiculous.
And there's no state law that says it should be 2,500 feet. And so they came and spoke to us about that 2 years ago. I've been going to Sunflower Alliance meetings on Zoom, and they're focusing on that, the setbacks from oil drilling. We also had Joan Johnson talk to us about no coal in Richmond, because they're increasing the size of the Levin terminal in Oakland to make it larger so they can pull have these trains go with our coal to the Oakland, and then they're going to ship it to China. It's not even for us. And a lot of the low-income families that live around the train tracks, I mean, there's a high percentage of asthma, and if you all want to, I've been putting, I think I put the link for the Sunflower Alliance meeting. I think it's Sunday. So you might want to participate in that. I mean, there's some really important local issues about climate change just in our county.
60 Minutes I saw a whole news report on a national network about that, about how the poor are especially affected, mostly minorities, of course,
right,
by that fact that the oil stations and the ports.
Yeah.
A lot of letters went into our county about the oil in Brentwood, I think it was,
That's what we're
because
talking about, yeah.
too close to where people lived. And I think it had a big effect.
Yes, we did. There was a push to that, to the Sunflower Alliance. So you might want to, I have a link in the email. You might want to attend and see what's happening. Shirley, do you have anything going on?
No, I just moved here, so I'm still unpacking and doing all that good stuff. So.
Oh, okay. I'm talking to Shirley Shilongoski.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, nothing much going on in clean money yet. Still kind of quiet. We haven't had any calls. Like I said, the only thing we're going to be working on this year is Ballot Disclose Act, which is going to put the people who are for and against the propositions directly on there. But yeah, nothing's moving right now.
Okay. Too many other
And-
things.
And I did put in the chat reference to the fluvoxamine that's talking about a large study going on at University of Washington. And it was in the news in the Washington Post today. And so it's getting more press beyond that. That was back in December, this article, but it was in the news today too.
That's good. Whenever I have any medical information, I'll go to PubMed. I mean, because they're reliable. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brody, and everybody. It was very important.
Well, I'm getting tired out.
Thank you, Brody. Good job.
Yeah,
Yeah, enjoyed it very much, Brody.
yeah, it was really good.
Great job, Brody. Bye.
Thanks so much. Okay, have a good night, everybody.
Nice meeting everybody.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.